We've seen a picture like this used by many people before, that if you are to look at relationships between incomes and urbanization, there's sort of a linear kind of pattern where countries that urbanize more tend to have higher incomes. And countries, as they go through the structural transformation, shed a lot of jobs out of agriculture and get a lot of jobs into non-agriculture stuff, that's manufacturing and that's services. So this is kind of the fundamental picture one thinks, if you believe in cities, that they are central to processes of economic development. So when we started working in Africa about 4 or 5 years ago, the question that all of us wanted to ask at the bank and in collaboration with external researchers was whether these patterns broadly hold true in Africa, or if Africa indeed is different. And that kind of set us up on this big agenda of looking at Africa's urban transformation. But to all of you who are probably not economists, I just want to give you kind of the big 3 ideas that we care about cities and productivity and jobs. And there's one thing that really matters, what we call agglomeration economies as economists. But to most people, cities do well because they're incredible matchmakers. They're incredible matchmakers because they connect firms to other firms and they trade inputs, they connect workers to firms and information kind of across the city. So thick labor markets providing this great market for specialized service providers, and the things that cities do well with density is knowledge spillovers. So in terms of a basic fundamental issue, if anyone kind of working on cities were to say, how do you measure what cities are delivering? Cities are delivering a fine balance, which is about the benefits of density, which makes cities livable, they make cities connected, they make cities affordable, and that is what economists call the urban wage premium. And as cities grow, stuff also becomes really congested, and that's land scarcity, commuting costs, environment externalities, and that's what we call the urban cost penalty. And the whole idea is to balance these forces, get the urban wage premium to really go up, keep the urban cost penalty to really go down. And how do you do this? And the way we think about it is markets are amazing mechanisms to get this right. The markets for land within cities, the markets for labor moving across cities, the markets for capital, and then also issues about product markets or movement of goods. But we also know that when cities are built, there are numerous market failures. And the biggest market failure comes from all the positive spillover effects that you have on others, others have on you. Markets don't really internalize it, so cities kind of become less productive. So how do you think about market failures and provide the right infrastructure? So when we started asking this question and looked at that first graph that I showed you on the links between urbanization and economic development, East Asia really got it right. If you looked at China, Korea, Vietnam, the more the country urbanized, they could get scale economies in production, they could kind of grow. So those were simultaneous processes that were going hand in hand. But as we go and look across Africa, the links that I show here in Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria, it's like the links between urbanization and economic development have been severed. And that is what makes African urbanization fundamentally different. A question that you would pose to me is saying, of course that's going to happen. Africa is urbanizing while the continent is poorer. But is that it? So will it catch up as the continent gets from $1,000 per capita to $5,000 per capita? Or are there fundamental failures in institutions, in governance, in infrastructure that sever the link? And that's some of the questions we set up to answer. But just to kind of give you a context, and Ani's seen the slide before, today you're dealing with 472 million people living in Africa's cities. That's going to grow to about 660 by 2025 and about 1 billion in the next 25 years. Think about the magnitude of jobs that African cities need to create to make this demographic or this people's transition really kind of productive. So the research we have done becomes even more important today. The last 10 years of Africa was all about commodity booms and oil booms. If you see in the newspapers, that boom's gone away. So today, this whole model about accumulating a lot of factors and trading with the rest of the world doesn't seem to work. Africa needs a new way to do business. And it can do business if cities are functioning well. If cities are economically dense, which is they're livable, they're connected, and they're affordable. But the research we have done has shown that African cities are growing at a completely different trajectory. They're crowded, and I'll tell you about it. They're disconnected, and they're costly. And I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes telling you all the facts that we have put together to demonstrate these three ways in which African city development is different from what, say, East Asia experienced. The first thing that we started looking at in terms of packing people into cities was looking at population density. And this is a number or sort of graphic you will see on most studies related to urbanization. They consider population density, that is number of people per square kilometer, number of people per hectare, as a metric of urban success. So if we take that as a barometer, African cities are no different than cities in the Middle East and North Africa, or about the same as cities in East Asia and the Pacific. So you would then say, what's going on here? Cities in Africa are just as dense, so why aren't they delivering the sort of productivity benefits you want them to deliver? The reason is that Africa's urbanization is happening in two distinct processes. People are coming into cities, they're urbanizing people, but they're not urbanizing investment. And that disconnect is something I want you to remember through the presentation, because the divergence in the urbanization of people and the urbanization of capital is at the root of a lot of the critical issues we see today. So we said, how do we measure this? How do we measure that urbanization of capital is lacking? Without great information on production statistics in African cities and investment statistics, we decided to look at pictures of Earth taken from space. And a lot of you must have seen night lights done at 6 in the evening, which is a great measure of economic activity. But there's another set of night lights that's taken by NASA, and it's taken of pictures of the world at 2 in the morning. And we found those pictures reflect infrastructure, the stuff that kind of reflects even after all the shops have turned off, have closed down. And we looked carefully at pictures from space at 2 in the morning. And on the left side here, on the vertical axis, we said, what is the intensity of light to people? And on the right, how does it change when cities grow or change in size? And we found is something really interesting, that for the majority of African cities that you see out here, they have a lot of people, but very low infrastructure people ratios. If you were to kind of look at the same population size and look at cities even in Durban, those are very different. Then let's move from the cities of 5 million to the cities of 10 million. Sorry, something's happened there. And again, the same pattern emerges: underinvestment in urban infrastructure. So guess what happens when a lot of people are packed in and not enough capital to support it? African cities get characterized by being extremely crowded. That means the benefits of co-location are stymied by cost of congestion at very early levels of development. And so this is kind of putting all these analyses together. And what you see, the majority of African cities are on the top left-hand quadrant. And this tells you two things. One, that the peak economic density measured on the horizontal axis is very low. Second, the pace at which the economic density goes down is very fast. That means that African cities like Addis, like Nairobi, like Dakar, have a lot of economic activity right downtown, and then 5 miles from the downtown it all disappears. If you were, as most of you are Americans, If you think about a city like Chicago, back in 1905, the majority of economic activity was within the square blocks, 5 square blocks around Madison Street. Today, Chicago goes up, hundreds of miles, the economic activity spreads. So one way to think about African cities is they reflect something at very early stages of development, not a lot of activity, and activity concentrated downtown. The question is that have cities grown to 5, 10 million exhibiting the same characteristics? And if path dependence sets in, then are we too late to change that? We also looked from these aggregate statistics to looking at city-specific pairs. We compared large cities like Lagos with Seoul. And on the left are distributions of where people live. And as you go away from the left, as you go on the horizontal axis, it's distance from the city center. In terms of people, the graph on the left, Lagos and Seoul look fairly similar. In terms of economic activity or infrastructure, they're very different. So if you see Lagos is completely flat and low in terms of the infrastructure to support the same number of people, Seoul, it actually goes very nicely from very high where the demand is high peaks, all the way coming down. These are standard urban graphs that a lot of you have seen in terms of distance from the city center, kind of characterizing land rents. And this is where African cities are different. We did the same looking at a smaller city like Accra, comparing it to Cairo, which is much larger. But again, population densities on the left look similar, but economic densities on the right look completely different. The African city, on average, is concentrated in the downtown, but then flattens out really soon. But taking the city pairs to a more aggregate level, what we also did was look at urban capital investments as shares of GDP as countries urbanize. And here, of course, Africa over the last, from the 70s onwards, has put very little on capital investment, less than 20% of GDP. China, when it was rapidly urbanizing, put about 35% in capital investment, all the way to the latter part of the 2000s, where it was about 45–50%. So there's a timing issue. And the timing is that countries in East Asia have managed to get the timing of people and capital correct. Countries in Africa are just lagging behind. We also looked at various other measures to see the links between where people live and how much capital is there to support them. This is incredible data that we put together from the insurance industry. And we asked the question, if a city was hit by a natural disaster, it was razed to the ground, what would be the capital required to build it up to its current stock? In Nairobi, the value was about $9 billion. In Dar es Salaam, it was about $12 billion. The intensity of rebuilding, though, is much higher in Nairobi than in Dar es Salaam. If you think these numbers mean something, we compared them to the poorest cities in Central America, which outstrip these numbers 5–1. So there is a huge, it's not only the infrastructure, but the top structures that are completely deficient. So if you look at the distribution of people and the organization of capital, there's a complete mismatch looking at across African cities. We also did household surveys, and in fact, all these household survey data are available for anyone who wants to use them. We have georeference household surveys for cities like Dar es Salaam, for Durban, where we have samples greater than 5,000 households, all georeferenced. And we asked the question, how does service delivery at the household level vary between the urban core, between the periphery, between shanty towns within and outside? And completely, like in Dar es Salaam, when we looked at improved water on the right-hand side, there is no part of the city that has more than 40% coverage on basic access to water. And this is, again, distance from the city center, right from those who have been to Dar, right from kind of this, the CBD all the way further out, about 35 kilometers out. So from various statistics, various pieces of data, data from space, data from the ground, data from asking businesses, it's clear that African cities are incredibly crowded, not livable. But that's only part of the story. The second part, which I think for your world resources report is even more important because of path dependence, is that African cities are disconnected. But disconnected not as you would think in terms of transportation, disconnected in land use and the organization of land. What really works for cities is when people can interact with each other. That's the benefit of being in a city. Valerie and I have a conversation, we share an idea, there's a financer out there, we kind of make an innovation out of an invention. And that happens because of proximity. So we very carefully looked at data from African cities, like Nairobi on the left, and compared it with cities worldwide to ask, if you are in the middle of a city, how many other people are you exposed to? How many other people can you interact with? Because that tells you the power of connections in a city. And on average, African cities were about 40% less exposed to others. So you have less neighbors to talk to or to interact with than cities around the world. Worse more, was interesting that African cities are completely fragmented in the way core urban development is formed. If you see the peaks in Nairobi, there are lots of places where nothing happens. And we kind of looked at satellite pictures for about 25 African cities, and a large part of downtown land is vacant. It's not left vacant by design, as you see in Paris or Barcelona. It's just vacant because of property rights are not clear on who develops it and at what scale. So the whole idea is that if you're my neighbor, then I have a higher chance of, if you're physically close, the interaction potential is higher. And I'll show you in the next graph why it happens, because what African cities are developing are like a bunch of villages put together. So if you think about an American model of urban development, there's a developer or a local government who puts together a large tract of land. They provide in bulk infrastructure, subdivide the land, and then the market takes care of it. It's been impossible, or we don't see in the data, that African cities have any sort of developer who puts a contiguous piece of land together. So you have one clump here, there's a lot of unused land, another clump here, and so the extent to which people can interact really drops down. But this kind of gets clarified in some of the spatial work we're doing, where we asked what happened over the last 10 to 20 years on the spatial expansion of African cities. And there are three things that could happen. You could have a lot of infill development, you could have natural outgrowth linked to an existing boundary, you could have development, or you could have leapfrog. And what's happening is that extension out of the kind of the original built-up area explains a majority of urban growth. But it is the nature of extension that's really problematic. So this is what I say patches. African development in patches. So it's not that downtown land is being used one piece parcel next to another parcel. They're just kind of, like you see out here, they're just leapfrog parcels which are not connected to anywhere to the existing urban space. And that's the majority of urban expansion in Africa. And it's very different from East Asia, very different from Latin America. I think there may be parallels with South Asia, but we haven't done the research to tell you so. But in all these cities, the number of patches as a share of total urban development is growing, and these are isolated patches. There's a huge implication of this. Not only does it reduce potential agglomeration benefits, it increases the cost of service delivery. It completely undermines the ability of a city to benefit from scale economies in providing water, sanitation, maybe other kinds of network public goods. And this is one of the key findings that we're kind of trying to work at. And the researchers at LSE who are doing this link a lot of this to legacies related to colonial history. And they're looking at the trajectories which with British colonial history differs from French colonial history in terms of evolution of cities. But the point is, no matter where, it's consistent that it's actually patchwork development that's leading the way of Africa's urban development. Now think about the scenario here. If you were a transport planner and wanted to connect the city, what kind of scale are you connected to what kind of scale? You have no scale to connect to, right? So I think that's one of the more fundamental issues for your report as you think about this. So the other thing we did was, I told you about pictures taken from space at night. We also took satellite pictures taken during the daytime, and we could distinguish different sorts of way a city's land is used. Commercial use, residential use, shanties, or bare land. And what we did was to ask, we looked at where the people live, but where are the jobs? And one would expect, even in this highly concentrated downtown sort of focused place, most of the jobs should be downtown. If I were to look at a place like Ho Chi Minh City in East Asia, 23% of the land cover is used for industrial uses or commercial uses. So at least people have somewhere to get to if they're commuting to work. We did the same for Africa. Only 6% of the land in the center of the city is used for commercial purposes, no-scale economies. Addis, 1%. Kigali, less than 1%. So we have not only neighborhood fragmentation, we have dispersion of where the jobs are. On top of it, when African cities were built, they really underinvested in roads infrastructure. So we took the same pictures from space, and we used very high-resolution satellite maps and things that go beyond me called object-oriented processing, and figured out the width of roads in each city, the quality of the roads based on whether it's paved or unpaved. In fact, this kind of research is absolutely on the frontier of remote sensing and image processing. And we could see what part of the city is actually covered by roads. And on an average, if you look at a city like Paris, London, or Barcelona, it's about 20–25%. And what you see in those cities is that they kind of flatten out as the city grows. But you see in an average African city, it's between 7 and 9%. And it's not only 7 and 9% evenly distributed, it's all concentrated around the same CBD. So if you're a poor person living far out, not only do you live far from amenities, you also have no access to transportation services because the roads haven't been built in. The fundamental problem here is as the cities grow and you've underinvested in early infrastructure, it becomes very difficult to retrofit. Just getting the rights of way secure to expand the roads is a nightmare. But in cities like Addis and Dar es Salaam, they have in fact doubled the road density over the last 10 years. And that's something to say about, the kind of the need for urban road space and development. But the consequence of this, all this, has been that most people have been pretty disconnected from the jobs. So we looked at a household survey from JICA. And there we asked the question, if you were to travel an hour from where you live and take the minibus taxi system called the matatu, how many jobs would you access? And that's 28% for a matatu, but majority of people, 14% for the matatu, and then given that majority of people walk to work, it's only 8%. So here's a whole city of 7 million plus, where people traveling an hour cannot access more than 14% of opportunities, and if they walk, not more than 8% of opportunities. And if you recall, the whole idea of having a city is a thick, integrated labor market. This completely is fragmenting the labor market of the city, dampening of job opportunities, but also dampening on potential agglomeration benefits. So finally, let me kind of come to the part about urban costs. And while those who sort of do urban planning or transportation planning kind of figured out the crowded and disconnected stories in their own work, it's the urban costs that probably none of you thought about. And the reason is, you often think that if a place is poor, they're going to be cheap. And as cities kind of get better off, they get more expensive. But what we did was we systematically looked at cost of living data in African cities benchmarked to every other country in the world for which comparable price data are available. And this is in fact a startling finding that on average, African cities are about 30% more expensive on consumption items than cities in other parts of the world for the same income levels. And so we kind of compared city by city, but we also looked at kind of countries. We looked at every price comparison data set available in the world. And like in food prices are about 33% higher in African cities. Housing prices, especially in the formal market, are about 57 to 60% higher. So not only are these fragmented cities disconnected cities, they're also unaffordable cities. But it's not only cost of living to families. What's also striking is how expensive labor costs are in African cities. So not only costly for families, but costly for firms. And this was really striking. We looked at every data set from the World Bank Enterprise Survey that compiles information on cities and the nominal wage paid out. And here again, when you look at the red line and the cities in red, African cities are incredibly expensive. This is really, if you think about from a competitiveness lens, this really hurts. Part of the reason we argue they're expensive in the formal sector is they're compensating workers for all the terrible living conditions, for lack of connectivity, for lack of housing, and this gets compensated in terms of higher wages. And we looked at cities and compared Johannesburg with Bogota, Djibouti and Mumbai and others, and manufacturing wages in Africa are completely much higher than other parts of the world. So when you think about putting all these three building blocks together, you have cities that are not economically dense. In fact, they're crowded, they're disconnected, and they're costly. What this is doing, when all these three forces are working together, is that they're putting African cities into a low development trap. And there are two sorts of development traps. One is when workers or families come to cities, they kind of are setting out a future of low expectations. Low expectations where services are bad, housing quality is bad, commuting is expensive. African cities might well as put up a sign saying, I'm out of service. And from a business point of view, the expectations about the future of the African cities are very low. Wages are high, transport costs are high, it's very difficult to put land together to do business services. And so you might as well put another sign up saying, closed for business. These are two things that are happening at the same time. Service delivery is bad, business productivity is bad. And this is pretty much leading to another whole round of low expectations, which further worsens investment levels and kind of doesn't help in aligning different investments together. So what we see today is a whole set of decision making without clear rules, without vision in terms of urban management, which kind of links to these core ideas. Let me elaborate on this for about 5 minutes. So the big issue that we raise and we find in the research is that urban regulations in African cities are very stringent. They not only limit the supply of housing, they kind of make it very difficult for developers to come subdivide land. So it's not only the housing market, but the land market working together. That combined with very limited transport infrastructure means people don't have choices. They can't trade off downtown locations that are expensive for far off locations that are cheaper because there's no transport service. People can't make that choice. And what's also on top of that is really low investments in basic services. So basic amenities such as water, schools, clinics, which are found in many more vibrant cities, are just missing. As a result, people are making incredibly tough choices. We looked at kind of satellite pictures again and looked at where the slums were compared to formal settlements in relation to how close they were to business centers. And on average, we found that the distance between an irregular or a slum settlement and commercial centers were much less, much lower compared to the commercial, to the residential, the regular neighborhoods. And the reason is people are making these trade-offs, willing to underconsume housing and amenities, willing to overconsume risk, just so that they can be close to a job. And these sorts of trade-offs are incompatible with good development policy. Second, not only are the service levels bad, businesses are really hurting. One, you see the lack of infrastructure, the lack of top structures are making cities costly. And the thing you want to remember is all these costs are doing one thing. They're making African cities local cities. That means they produce and they sell locally traded goods. They don't get into the market for internationally traded goods. That means as more people come into the city, they face a declining wage curve and they get poorer just producing the same thing. And what's even more important is that firms are scattered instead of clustered. And all these costs need to be compensated. So firms need to pay high nominal wages, and these nominal wages are driven by urban costs and not by productivity. I'm going to skip over these regressions, but tell you this one picture. This is a picture about the distribution of tradable sectors and non-tradable sectors in Africa, in African cities. And most African cities, like Dar, Kigali, Kampala, Dakar, what you'll see is the orange color is really low compared to cities in other parts of the world. What they're doing are just being local economies. They're artisanal cities. They're not cities like household names that you think about, which are trading with the rest of the world. In fact, this is one of the key findings, that the majority of what African cities are doing is doing local business. Large cities in Africa are catering for the local market, not the regional market, not the international market. And this has huge consequences in terms of productivity and development. But even if I were to forget the tradability of services, the tradability of economic activities in African cities, the locally traded stuff needs clustering too. So if I were to look at, and this is data we pulled together from the economic census from Rwanda, and the tradable sector, that is stuff Rwanda trades with the rest of the world, is fairly well distributed in Kigali. But what's really worrying is the stuff Kigali makes for itself, or for Rwanda in general, is completely dispersed across the city. What this means is that there are no economies of scale, no economies of specialization. Think about a really simple example about bakers. If each baker is located dispersed away from each other, they'll just cater to the local market. They'll just produce bread. But if they're concentrated together, one will do croissant, the other will do baguettes. So the benefits of specialization is something that comes with scale and it comes with density. And the majority of African cities not only limit themselves to be local economies, they even disperse local economies therein. This again has huge productivity implications. So what I kind of in a recap have told you is that cities need to be economically dense to deliver economic productivity and welfare gains. To be economically dense, cities need to be livable, they need to be connected, they need to be affordable. Africa's cities are going on a completely different trajectory. They are incredibly crowded, they're disconnected and fragmented, and they're costly. What this is doing is trapping workers into really poor living conditions, but more importantly, trapping cities to becoming local cities, not international cities. Even in local sectors that could benefit from scale and specialization, African cities have more dispersal, that is, doesn't allow for economies of scale at all. So what does one do about it? One simple answer that a lot of people have told me is we need to wait till Africa gets richer, because Africa is urbanizing on average incomes of about $1,000 per capita. East Asia urbanized at the same level when it was $3,500 per capita. The Middle East and Latin America reached this level of urbanization at about $5,000 per capita. So the place is poor. But the problem with all this advice is that urban structures are like putty clay. It's not that you can reshape urban structures once they're formed. They're like clay models. You have to kind of put everything down and rebuild. So there's huge path dependence and huge interdependencies with urban structures. So Africa is urbanizing at $1,000. We need to do something about it, and we need to do something now. So there are many people, again, who will come up with big infrastructure solutions. And in Africa, if you've worked in Africa, you realize that there's this debate, there's a race on between institutions and investments in infrastructure. And to a large extent, with external aid, the people supporting investments in infrastructure are winning the race. But what we argue here The fundamental problem with Africa's development is not lack of investment per se, but lack of institutions that allocate factors, particularly land, particularly labor across cities, and products. And getting the land markets start working and getting land regulations to comply or to be compatible with Africa's level of development can do a lot of good. Alongside, we are making a case based on research on infrastructure that's early on. The World Bank used to do a lot of projects called sites and services. They fell out of favor. But all the evaluations we're doing 20, 30, 40 years down show that, in fact, there have been great benefits in the long term from doing the basic sites and services early on. I'm going to provide you 4 examples before I close. So one is the issue about urban redevelopment and the case of Nairobi. Has anyone heard about people called the Nubians? So Nubians were the Nubians fought for the British Army, and they were Kenyans, and in kind of for their service to the British Crown, they were given the piece of land to live on, which is called Kibera today. They were given no property rights, but they were given, nobody told them to leave, but when the British left, they weren't left with tradable property rights. So today, some of the big issues about urban redevelopment in Kenya and Nairobi is what do you do with Kibera? So we had research done basically saying that the lack of property rights means that the middle of Nairobi is occupied by land that isn't being put to its most useful use. And the welfare cost of that comes out to be about $1.8 billion. And that is research done by Vernon Henderson at LSE. And the point is that he makes is that the lack of land markets, the lack of tradable property rights really is putting in place a system where the cities can't respond to modern day realities. And so what happens, you see, he looked at land prices from the city center going down in non-slum residential neighborhoods. It follows almost an American pattern. If you're close to a CBD, land values are high. Far off from the CBD, land values are low. But then when you look at informal settlements, it's quite the other way around. So there's huge market imperfection and a welfare gain to be had from sorting out allocative factors, and that's kind of an issue one needs to think about. Second is an issue I kind of stumbled across when I was working in Dar es Salaam. The minimum lot size in Dar es Salaam is 375 square meters. There is no one, no poor person in the world who can afford to put land together that's minimum land of 375 square meters. In fact, the majority of the city, which is 90% of the city, does not comply with the city's land use regulation. Yet, this is a land use regulation. They have 375. They want to go up to 500. When Philadelphia was formed, and these are pictures of initial plots from Philadelphia, the minimum lot size was 28 square meters. And you had pretty decent families living in Philadelphia at that time, right by the main square. So the point is that rather than thinking about taking land use regulations from the British Town and Country Planning book, one needs to think about flexible land use regulations. It's not about today's development in Dar, that's the problem. It's when the pressure on redevelopment comes in, then all this land is basically stuck in the market. And any new uses, commercial, industrial, infrastructure will absolutely get stymied. Third, let's think about sites and services and early infrastructure. This is a picture that was taken about 2 neighborhoods in Dar es Salaam. One is this neighborhood on the south where they did upgrading, and the neighborhood on the top where they did sites and services. These sites and services projects went up in 1970. For a while they were written off, but all the satellite pictures you see 40 years later clearly show that the neighborhood grids and the organization and the provision of basic services have lived on and in fact have formed well-formed decent neighborhoods. On the other hand, a lot of the upgrading sites completely went into disarray. So the point we want to make is that rather than thinking about doing everything at once, governments may want to think about just laying out the course for future urban development early on. So I'm going to not give you any answers, but leave you with fundamental questions. The thing that we have learned from our research is that urban development needs to happen at scale for it to deliver livability, productivity, make it affordable. But the question is, and for a lot of you in your report, is whether the current models about incremental development are compatible with models that enable scale. Or is it that we need to think big bang, but that has a whole lot of political economy considerations? Second, in a lot of African cities and cities around the developing world, there is this fad about density corridors and mobility. But the question is whether the small-scale provider industry is more suitable for today's fragmented urban development patterns, or are scale-dependent technologies, is it possible to use them to create some kind of enable densification? We don't know that. But more and more the work I do in places like South Africa is that there are a lot of technological solutions, but they don't really help in mobility. The third is about questions related to the models of development, formality or informality. And I don't think we have a very great understanding of whether the future development of African cities at scale will need a move from informality to formality in development models, both in jobs and in homes, or are these compatible? And are there any examples you have seen that you get scale and specialization alongside informality? And those are issues that we are grappling with as we work on this research. But I think the main contribution of what we have done is to document the different pattern of urban development in Africa and the associated costs. Thank you. Just before I end, there are about 20 different research papers on this website, all really new, and if one wants to kind of read them, they're in the public domain, all the models, and I hope by next month we should be able to put the data sets up there too.